How to say your first name. It is Renata.
Yes.
Yes, Renata Sanders. And Renata Sanders is a genealogist and family historian. She particularly does African American family history. North Carolina is the area she researches the most. She does person of color genealogy, which is why I couldn't wait to bring her on to talk about our topic today. Andy's going to go ahead and drop in a link to her blog and to her Twitter handle so you can all follow her because she has such goodness to share. And she's not a stranger to the YouTube platform because many of you have or can see her on the Black Pro Gen Live panel discussions here on YouTube. And so we're so glad to have you. That's a big long intro.
So I wanted to
I'm
real
really
quick
glad
for
to
our,
be
our
here.
visitors or our viewers is if you have African American heritage that you know of, put a comment here saying that I know of African American heritage, and if you suspect something that you have some African American heritage, put it there and make sure as you're going on, if you have any questions about it, then feel free to put those in the comments, and we'll be letting Renata answer those questions.
Absolutely. So how are you doing over there in North Carolina?
Well, I'm in Virginia.
Oh,
Yes, most of my ancestry is from North Carolina, but I live in Newport News, Virginia,
okay.
and I'm doing well. We're having kind of a wind event right now. It's in the process of dying down, but it's been a tough morning with winds almost gusting around 60 miles per hour.
Wow.
So it's been a kind of scary morning.
Now,
But
are
if
you
see me go
right there near the coast
that-
then, or
very close,
okay,
yes.
like near Kitty
Yeah, so
Hawk
if you
where
see
they
me
flew the
turn around or
planes?
something, it's probably a big wind happening.
Oh, wow.
What did you ask me,
I say
Andy?
like near Kitty Hawk where they Wright brothers did the planes. Are you near there or?
She's in Virginia.
I'm about
Virginia.
an hour and 45
I was
minutes
thinking North
from
Carolina.
there.
Uh-huh.
No, I'm in Virginia. A lot of people think I'm in North Carolina because most of my blog posts, since all of my ancestry is from North Carolina, all of my lines.
Right.
And so if you follow my blog, you'll probably think I'm in North Carolina, but I'm in Virginia. But I do research broadly, and I do client work for, not just African Americans, but for all people researching, American genealogy, I will say.
Perfect.
I'm excited to be here.
Good. So, for those of you who ask, hey, who can do my genealogy? Typically, we do not do personal research, but you could definitely hire our special guest, and she can help you with the various research projects that you have. But today, we're going to dive into debunking myths about African American research. And now I know we have an international audience. Anna Karin, she is from Sweden because she wants to get my Swedish ancestry. I hope you'll find some value in today's presentation because I find that a lot of the myths that we're going to talk about can apply to any area of research. So let's start with the first one. Are you ready, Andy?
I am.
Okay, so the first one says everyone who was of African descent was enslaved prior to 1865. So why is this a myth?
Well, it's a myth because it's absolutely untrue.
Okay.
It is a known fact that almost 11% of African ancestor people in America were free people of color. And that happened in many different ways. It happened, of course, through some people being emancipated by former owners, but there were also many, many people who were born free.
Okay.
It's important to know the law, and the law was that when you were born, all people took the condition of their mother. So if you were born to an enslaved mother, even if you had a white father, you were going to be born enslaved. But if you were born to a white mother or a free mother who may have already been a free person of color, then that child would be born free. And through this, we got the almost 11% of free people of color.
That's
so
right.
It's really important to study the law. The other thing is that in the colonial era, when before all these laws were really put into place to kind of turn the blacks who were here into enslaved people, blacks and whites were in relationships with each other, especially whites who were servants, who were indentured servants, were in relationship with blacks who were free, as well as the few blacks who may have been in a more like an enslaved status prior to about the 1640s.
Okay.
So it's important to kind of really dig in and not only know that someone may have been a free person of color, but to see how they achieved that status in the first place.
So
Okay.
was there any migrations from Africa to the United States or to the New World in the colonial times that were not because of the slave trade?
Yes, that's a tricky kind of answer, but everyone's learning now about 1619. And I am not an expert on it, but I can kind of say that what my understanding is that the people the 20 and odd, so they're called, who were on the ship that was brought in, they were maybe originally meant to be enslaved, but they were not enslaved when they came here. And it wasn't until certain laws were put in place to kind of designate them or designate their offspring by that time uh, in a more of an enslaved status that began to happen. Prior to that, they were free people that were kind of living almost as if indentured servants themselves. And once they were released from that servitude, they were purchasing land. They had businesses. They were teaching the white men and even some of the natives how to grow crops and do trades. So they came here. They were intelligent people who, yes, they had been captured with the intent to enslave them, but that was not their status when they came here. And that, Andy, is a place that's right down the street from me, Old Point Comfort at Fort Monroe.
Okay.
It's in Hampton, which is the adjoining city to Newport News, and it's the city I grew up in. So,
So
yes, I would encourage everybody to study the literature on 1619 to learn more about.
so here's a follow-up question on that. Is from so like in the original colonization here of the New World, you had England and Spain and the Dutch and I'm not sure who else, France, all competing for different areas. Um, which of them were, I guess, the most active in the slave trade as far as bringing Africans over to the United States?
I'm not sure that I have the answer to that
Okay.
question right off. Yeah,
I'm just
no,
wondering if there's one
I
that
would
was more so than
probably
another,
say
or how that.
my guess would be the English or the Portuguese, but I'm definitely not a historian. Genealogy is my area, and I must know some history, but I'm not the one to quote on
Okay,
that.
no
Okay.
problem.
So I don't have the numbers on that.
That's
Now,
okay.
Catherine Hall Knight, if you look up Catherine Hall Knight or Rick Murphy, they would be able to answer that or
Okay.
answer that through their literature that they have out.
All
Perfect.
right. So Anna Corinne's got a question. This is coming forward a little bit later in time. Did some free black people? Let me reword this. Were there any free black immigrants to the USA before 1900?
Um, yes, I think so. Before 1900, yes.
Okay. Okay.
Perfect. And then Brian Gibson
Because
just
everyone
go ahead.
was free by 1900.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure if there was any migration still occurring then
Yeah, that's
because
something, again, I don't have the statistics on that, but I would just imagine
I.
that by 1900, there probably would have been at least some uh, Africans who would have migrated to
And
America.
I'm even thinking then it might not have necessarily been from Africa so much, but it might have been from the Caribbean where there was also
Caribbean,
large slave
yes,
plantations and really where I think the
absolutely.
majority of the slaves were imported into the Caribbean and then South America.
Yes,
So
Perfect.
yes,
And then Brian
much more.
Gibson wanted to share that the groups was Portuguese to Brazil. So,
okay.
Okay. So I had Portuguese, right?
Well, yeah.
There
Well,
you
that
go.
would make sense what you said, that the Portuguese were probably really involved because Brazil was really heavy as far as trafficking in slaves for the different plantations down there. And I know that Brazilians, I think they are the largest percentage of African American heritage when you're looking at your DNA, of people. So cool. here in the New World.
All right, so let's go to myth number 2. That one. That one. All right. This one is slaves didn't have last names. Now, I'm so glad you're going to talk about this myth because I've heard it like everywhere I can think. So can you tell me more about this?
Yes. So it's not true that enslaved people did not have last names. Not all enslaved people had last names, but if you begin to study some of the records, you will see surnames attached to many of the names of the enslaved. And where this comes from, well, it comes kind of from for a variety of reasons. A lot of times it would be the name of the enslaved person's first owner. And so let's say you purchased me, and I was Renata, and you purchased me from somebody whose last name was Jones, then even though your last name may be Smith, I'm going to forever be Renata Jones in your inventory. Okay. And it kind of lets you know where Renata came from.
Okay.
Another thing that was, and that's just one way that it was done. Sometimes it could be from the trader, like the name of the trader, so that you remember who you purchased this person. It's mostly in records. So it may not be that the slave owner was day to day calling the enslaved person by these names, but in written records, this was a way to keep track of where they came from. The other thing that I've seen on a personal level is I recently, in the last about year and a half ago, found that I am a descendant of the of enslaved people from the Somerset Place plantation in Washington County, North Carolina. And I have seen my own ancestors named Peter Elsie. Again, like using my own name, Renata Elsie. And all of these were the children of a woman named Elsie. And so Elsie was used as their surname. So that enlightened me as to another way that surnames were being used. But you will definitely see in the records many, many enslaved people using surnames or being given surnames by their owners.
Now, I have a question, and it's okay if you don't know, but it just triggered a thought. There's a lot of cultures that just don't have last names to begin with. So did slave people lose their last names when they came over? Or did they just not have them to begin with?
Well, I don't think they were called surnames, but they lost whatever their names were when they came over. Because just as you saw in the movie Roots, with the whole thing about Kunta Kinte trying to keep his African name, but when the first Africans that were enslaved were brought over, they were given mostly European names. Okay. So they were not able to use their original African names.
Okay. Thank you so much for clarifying that. That is good tips.
So with in research then, in talking about this, you have these different naming conventions. What are some tips for people that are getting started in finding their slave ancestors as to where to look, where to start as far as figuring out what those names might be and matching them up through the records?
So I think this brings us to another point we were going to talk about, where the question about all former slaves taking the name of their last owner.
Okay.
And I think we were going to talk about that anyway.
Yeah, that's actually next. Let's just go into it.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, it's fact that only about 10 to 15% of formerly enslaved people took the surname of their last owner. And a lot of people are very surprised by that.
Okay.
So if you're doing African American research, you cannot trust that just because, and again, I'll use the Smiths and the Joneses, just because the the known last name is Smith, that was the name of your ancestor's last owner. The 1870 census, which was the first in which all people are finally being enumerated by name, is really a crucial research point for those trying to research African American ancestors, because it gives you a lot of hints, it gives you a lot of clues. So I always tell people that if you don't know, like I didn't know when I started researching over 22 years ago, I had no idea why we had the Yarborough name. So if you don't know the reason why, then you definitely have to start off looking for slave owners in the area that are using the area where your ancestors are, that have the same surname as whatever your ancestor is using at that time.
Okay.
But it's not a cut and dry situation, because again, only 10 to 15% of the time is that going to be your ancestor's last slave holder. But if you begin that at that point, you might get lucky like I did. And it did turn out that my great grandfather was in that 10 to 15%.
Right.
So I got lucky. If you don't get lucky, you can use clues from maybe what your ancestors named their children.
Okay.
Especially looking at middle names. That's been another thing that's been profitable for me. My great grandparents used the names of their former owners as their children's middle names.
Okay.
And I always say they did that just for me.
Oh.
Because it helped me to find. Both of them had multiple owners, and so
Okay.
it helped me, to find them.
That's great.
It's also important to know that the formerly enslaved could take any surname they wanted at emancipation.
So
So
1865, when they're all freed, it's basically a free-for-all as far as choosing the last names.
Absolutely. And so many went back and took the name of their first owner.
Okay.
A lot of times they did that because their families had been separated, and
so
this was a way to maybe be able to link back, right? If Massa Smith took your mother to Kentucky, and she's probably using the Smith name, you might go on and use the Smith name too as a way to be found or find her. So that's one way. Some took the name of an owner along the way. Maybe there was one that was kind to them in some way. I have a little issue with saying kind and slave owner in the same sentence, but they may have viewed it that way. Sometimes the name was reflective of their occupation. So you have names like carpenter, blacksmith, shoemaker.
Right.
Those are clues to their occupation, and that, if you were Jack the blacksmith and you were always referred to as Jack the blacksmith, you just may have taken blacksmith as your last name.
Okay.
A lot of people also took the name of someone respected in the community. Sometimes they took the surnames of free blacks who they may have admired. We have a lot of Lincolns because
I was going to actually ask that. Is there a lot of Lincolns and a lot of Abraham Lincolns in the?
You have Lincolns, you have Washingtons, you have Douglases.
Okay,
so
that's the one I was thinking of.
And then a lot of people took the name Freeman.
Yeah.
Because they were free men.
Right.
And so there were just so many different paths to that. And the other important thing to remember is that between 1865 and the early 1870s, these surnames also sometimes changed.
Oh,
so you might have started out as Smith and then decided to be Jones.
Okay.
Or you may find your family and then the family decides on one surname. So some people will change it. And the other thing is that you often might see a family and you have a brother and a sister, or you have a mother or a parent and child, and they do not share the same surname because they didn't have to.
Okay.
So it just gets really, really very tricky after
For sure.
emancipation.
I think that's true anywhere we're researching, but that is pretty
And
complicated.
one other,
Yeah, please.
well, I'm sorry, one small thing is that, and it kind of goes along with taking the name of that first owner, is that if they knew their parent's surname, then say the parent had a surname prior to emancipation, like we were just talking about a few minutes ago, and the newly emancipated person who's been separated from their parent knows what that surname was, they will take that parent's surname. And again, it's a way of hoping to reconnect with the other part of their family.
Now, you had mentioned the 1870 census for the first time that everybody was finally named. Was there any of slaves that were enumerated by name in the 1860 and the 1850 census?
No slaves, no enslaved people were enumerated by name.
But all the free blacks would have been
1850.
enumerated in the 1860 and 1850 census.
All free people, no
Okay.
matter, regardless of color. So 1850 and 1860 is the first time all free people are named, white, black, or anything, because 1840 and before that, only the head of household would have been named, and everyone else would have been a tick mark.
Right.
So a lot of people say, well, blacks were not enumerated prior to 1850, but that's not true. We were enumerated, just not by name,
Right.
but by gender and within age groups. We were there, but we just weren't enumerated by name, and neither were the other members of the household.
Right.
They were tick marks also.
So everybody, no matter your color, has problems once we get to 1840.
Right.
But I was looking in a Connecticut collection for 1830, and I did see a man named Amos who was enumerated in the colored section that they had. So there are people of color who are enumerated prior to 1840 and back, but they're just over there. And unfortunately, so in the whites, they had the males and then the age groups, and the females and then the age groups. But the colors, it was just what's the head of the household, and then everybody is lumped together, male and female. And I'm like, oh, that's so frustrating.
Well, if they were head of a household, they were probably free.
Right, exactly. It did say free people of color, but you couldn't differentiate, like, did they have three? I mean, if they'd have 3 children under 5, but what's that constitution? 2 girls and a boy, 2 boys and a girl.
Right. Exactly.
That's frustrating.
And that also made me think that there were some special, I don't know if you still call them censuses, but there were some special enumerations, some special schedules in different parts of the country where you may get lucky and find some names, but as per the rules from the Census Bureau for the federal census, they would not have been named prior to 1850.
All right. So let's go to myth number, I don't know. We're not numbering them so that everybody will stay tuned.
Okay.
But there is one I definitely want you to stay tuned to the end that she's going to tackle. It's a really good one, and I can't wait to talk about that. But the next question leads to records. The myth is it's impossible to find records about enslaved ancestors. So tell us why that is a myth.
It's a myth because there are many, 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 many records that encompass our enslaved ancestors. You just kind of have to know where to look for them. Basically, you have to remember that enslaved people were considered property. And so when you keep that in mind, then you think about the fact that just about anything we own, there's a record about it.
Right.
If you own a home, you own a car, you own furniture, whatever you own, there's a record that you purchased it. There's often records about its upkeep. And unfortunately, but fortunately, the same is true about enslaved human property. And so a lot of times people are not aware of how often enslaved people appear in court records.
Okay.
So when you know the location of your enslaved ancestors, you'll want to study the court records that may pertain to them, as well as free people of color. Free people of color are all throughout court records because there were so many laws that kind of restricted them and makes you question whether they were really free. But
Yeah.
they are in those court records, and especially in wills and probate and estate records of the former owners. If they died prior to emancipation, then their enslaved property will be inventoried right along with the furniture and the silverware and everything down to a teaspoon.
Right.
And those enslaved people will be named,
Okay.
especially when they have to be either divided or if they are willed in particular to an heir of the deceased, they will be named. Often their age may be given, especially if there's an inventory, their age will be given, a value will be given, a monetary value will be given. So that's a great place to look. Tax records, a lot of people don't realize that, again, it's property. And so you pay tax on your property. So you can check tax records. Many slaves in the South were insured. So there are records through insurance companies like New York Life and several others that you can find. Any owner records, if they're, all enslaved people were not on a plantation. That's kind of a myth too.
Okay.
So,
Did we have that one in the list?
No.
We
Bonus
did not
myths.
have that in. But many slave owners had just one or two or three enslaved people, so they didn't have this whole big mythical plantation. But they all kept records, and so if you're lucky enough to find family papers or any other types of records, maybe at your state archives or a university library or any other kind of repository that would have just papers from whatever that person's family, you can find ledgers, you can find journals, Bibles, diaries. Letters have been awesome for me for one of my family lines, where all the family letters, or what seems to be all of them, because it's a lot, are housed at the Southern History Collection at UNC
Perfect.
Chapel Hill. I was just there this past Sunday. So, you have to follow the records of the white slave owner in order to find information about the enslaved.
Right. And I keep smiling when you say things. I'll think of a question and then you answer it right when I think of that question. Like, where do we go for this? The State Archives. So that was just perfect timing. So, and I guess one of the things that I'm finding that we could look at this one of two ways, that yes, they're property, but there's lots of records. So what a gold mine, right?
Right.
And so
yes, that's why I said fortunate, not fortunate.
Right, because
but there's also
my German immigrant ancestors. There's just not a lot of records about him, and so I'm like, oh, that's kind of frustrating. And he's 1850, so it's not too much beyond another myth we're gonna get to here in a bit. But so yeah, I like that you're saying, it's unfortunate because of the thought process, but maybe they provided records. And then you can create that connection. I really like that. So thank you for bringing that up.
So I had a question on
and I
records.
still have a little more on that because I don't want to neglect records that were generated after emancipation that can give you information about the ancestor during enslavement. And mostly that is from Freedmen's Bureau records. And the thing that people should know about the Freedmen's Bureau is not only are there records of formerly enslaved people, but there are also records of their owners as well as indigent white people who the Freedmen's Bureau helped. But there'll be labor contracts, and oftentimes people did work for the person who had formerly enslaved them. They will have marriage records, which are known broadly as cohabitation records. And it was a cohabitation record that allowed me to verify my great grandfather and great grandmother's enslavement because it states on the cohabitation record that they were lately slaves but now emancipated. And so that's a documentary of their enslavement. And what that is, in case people don't know, is even though we say people said that they were married during slavery, and they may have even had a ceremony where the plantation owner or the preacher or someone married them, had them jump over a broomstick or whatever they did, slave marriages were actually illegal and not recognized.
Mm-hmm.
And so after emancipation, you had thousands and thousands of people who were living as man and wife but had no official record of a marriage.
Uh-huh.
And so the Freedmen's Bureau began to register these unions.
Perfect.
And we have records from that.
Right.
Now, in North Carolina and in Virginia, they actually passed an act in the General Assembly making it law that they had to come and register their marriages. So North Carolina and Virginia hold state. Well, it was done it was state law, but it was done at the county level.
Okay.
And so you find these records at the county level, and they also have them at the North Carolina State Archives.
Perfect.
So I have a question on tax records, and this is from, going and visiting some of the historical places up and down the East Coast where they will have, a piano that's basically disguised as a table because there was a specific table tax. So the question is were there any specific taxes on slaves that might be helpful for, where we actually have to list them out or actually enumerate them all for a certain tax?
Yes, there were taxes on the enslaved. I don't know if there was another name for that,
okay.
But yes, they were taxed.
And they would just be in
on
the tax.
Enslaved.
Okay, so they would just be within the natural tax rolls. You don't have to look for something separate.
Within the personal property.
Okay.
Within the personal property.
Okay, cool.
At least that's where I have found them in my research.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool. All right.
And
now,
I was talking about. I was talking about the Freedmen's Bureau, but I also want to this is the last one. I want to mention the Freedmen's Bank.
Okay.
Because those are two different things, and a lot of times people think that they are the same thing. But I have not found any of my ancestors who had accounts with the Freedmen's Bank, but those who do are very fortunate because they had to give so much information to open the account, and a lot of times that information will include not only the name of the person opening the account, but also the names of their family members, sometimes the names of their former owners. Of course, it will give their addresses and occupations. So all of these are the kinds of things genealogists want to know, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're lucky to find someone in the Freedmen's Bank, you're doing great. And I lied because there's one other thing. There are so many records on the formerly enslaved that I really can't even name them all in the show. And every time I think I'm finished, I think of another one. But
I hope you're going to say slave narratives.
Well, slave narratives, absolutely. Slave narratives, thank you. But I also want to mention Civil War pension files because Civil War pension files are, and I don't have any of those in my family either.
Right.
But people who have those get whole long narratives about their formerly enslaved life, who their owner or owners were.
Right.
Other people have to give affidavits and say that they know so-and-so was owned by Mr. So-and-so. So you get a plethora of information from those Civil War pension files. And I wish I had some, but I don't. And yes, the slave narratives, which I have just created a new talk about. So how could I forget that? But the slave narratives are awesome. Very good.
Perfect.
Sources.
Now, we've already talked about the myth that African Americans are not identified on the U.S. Census prior to 1870. Did you have anything else you wanted to talk about with that, or do you want to move on to the next myth?
I think we covered that pretty well.
Right.
I just will mention that, a lot of people are beginning to learn about the 1850 and 1860 slave schedules.
Right.
And just to clarify that they are an addendum to the federal census and that the enslaved are not named unless they're supposed to be named if they're 100 years or older, and they're also supposed to be named if they have a disability.
Okay.
But not all of the enumerators followed those rules, and we know they even on the regular census they don't always follow the rules.
Yes.
But you can get lucky sometimes and find one or where someone was named who was in one of those categories. There are also some other very lucky descendants who the enumerators did not follow the rules and they named all of the enslaved.
Right.
That has happened to a few people. But in general, they are only listed by their age and their gender and whether or not they are a fugitive of the state, meaning a runaway.
Okay.
And then again, they should be named if they're over 100. They should be named if they're deaf, blind, infirm, idiotic, as they like to say. But they're not always, but there will at least usually be a tick mark for that. I want to just say that there's a lot of debate about the usefulness of the slave schedules, but what I can say is that it is helpful when you have narrowed down the name of your slave owner or the last name of your slave owner and the location. And you can look at everybody whose last name is, let me get a new name, Davis.
Right.
Ooh, that one would be a lot. But anyway, who lived in, Newport News, Virginia, whatever. And you know that in 1860, you're looking for your great grandmother. And you know that in 1860, she was about 20 years old. Okay. So I'm just going to give a quick example. So let's say you find a Davis in Newport News, Virginia, and that Davis owns only male enslaved people. Can you eliminate that Davis as your great-grandmother's owner? Yes, because she's a female. So that helps you. And you can go through and use that process of elimination with the information the baseline information you took from the 1870 to help you to narrow down which of the Davises in Newport News, Virginia could possibly have been the owner. And then you start looking through the records of those Davises, and you can, and that's what I did with the Yarboroughs. So I was able to eliminate like 7, 8, 9 Yarboroughs and narrow it down to 2 or 3 when I was trying to find my great-grandfather Calvin. And I was able to narrow it down to the only couple that had someone his age and his gender in 1860. And in researching their papers, I was able to find him initially. So I will never say the 1850 and 1860 slave schedules are not helpful.
Right.
They are helpful,
right.
And that's how they can be.
Well, in genealogy, we have a lot of tools in our toolbox, and you never want to just discard one because what if that's the tool that would have unlocked that door?
Yeah, so got a question. This is going back to records real quick. What about the Underground Railroad? Was there any records for the escaped slaves that used the Underground Railroad?
So I have not had a lot of experience with those records because, again, I haven't found that it's touched my family, and I have not ever had a client yet that took me in that direction. But I would say that it's probably the same thing that the conductors probably left some records, the people that housed them. There also are narratives written by Blacks themselves who did escape slavery. And that's how we know the story of Solomon Northup. So you read there are many, many books and many, many narratives of former slaves who did escape on the Underground Railroad that can point you to some good clues about that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. Now, this one you wanted to add right before we went live, and that was, is it a myth that DNA testing cannot help us find our ancestors if we're African American?
Yes, this was added just because of a comment that I got on one of my posts about our chat today, and I'm not going to go deep,
That's fine.
and I have a disclaimer because I'm not a DNA expert, but I am, I guess you would say, an amateur genetic genealogist in that I am using DNA to further my own research, as well as every client that I have and every person that I'm coaching. So the myth in that is that DNA is absolutely helping those of us who have African ancestors
Okay.
to connect beyond the level that the paperwork will take us. Many of us descend from families who have been separated. And so the people that we are matching with on DNA, up to a certain level, we can match on trees. And, surnames are irrelevant once you've been separated.
Right.
So we can match on trees up to a certain level. But then you get to this point where, well, I don't know who my great grandfather's parents were, and she doesn't know who her great great grandfather's parents were. But our DNA is showing us that the amount of DNA that we share is probably from that couple, that same couple. And so we can then work together. Were they in the same location? Who owned your ancestor? Why is mine in North Carolina, but yours is in Georgia? And you can be sure with certain amounts of DNA that you are sharing a great grandparent or a grandparent. It's irrefutable. And so it definitely is guiding us. And even if we don't ever figure out that person's name who is at the next level that we don't know, we know that we're connected, and it can help us to figure out what happened with the ancestors that we do know about. So it's absolutely helpful to those of us researching African ancestors.
All right. That's great.
So I got a question here from Yvette. And this is probably going back to this is a scenario thing.
Okay.
So we might have to pick this apart to understand it. It says, when you have a roadblock, such as having the family's last name, and I think she means like the owners of the slave's last name, but found that the family came from Louisiana, but the enslaved family member was a slave in James, Virginia. So we're looking at two different locations where it looks like you have a family that's from one place, but there's evidence that the slaves that they own are from another place. Where would you look for records first?
It said
first.
So the first thing I would do is really study the owner's migration. And a lot of people are finding, and there was a migration of white people from the east to the west as those lands opened up. And so I would check to see where has the owner lived. And I would also look for as you're studying that owner, any bills of sale, any records of probate where enslaved people may have been willed to him from another family member that lived in another state. It's all through the owner that you're going to figure that out. It's hopefully not going to be a case like mine that appears to be a family that was just completely separated, because it's really hard to track them down. The surnames aren't going to do a lot for you once you go beyond the owner. But that's where the key is. You've got to research the owner's records, and you've got to research them in every place that owner ever lived. I'm working right now on a case of a former owner's husband. The husband died right before my great-grandfather was born. And then his wife brought my great-grandfather's pregnant mother from Tennessee to North Carolina, which is where my great-grandfather was born. But I'm researching in Tennessee to get records about the husband who died right before he was born, because I'm trying to find out what the name of my great-grandfather's mother could have been. So it's just tough. It's so tough because you have to spend so much time on not only that owner, but that owner's family to see whether, their property was transferred from one of them to the other. And it's just very time-consuming work.
So I'm chuckling because last year at Roots Tech, I interviewed Sherry Passy about what is the responsibility of folks who are descendants of slave owners for the enslaved, and her thought was get records out so that you don't have to waste so much time searching these people, right? You guys are working together. Yes. It seems like just get records out there and not hide the fact that they were enslaved, because if you bring forth those records, it would help you.
Absolutely. I give a talk called Researching Enslaved Ancestors, It Takes a Village. And that talk is geared towards the descendants of slave owners. And it's exactly that. It's about sharing what they can do to help those who are researching the enslaved to get to those records, get to that knowledge. And in many times, they're related to us. And so, so we get to that also. But it's really all about sharing. And even though a lot of the records are available, say online, people should know only about, just like the free people of color, about 10 to 15% of what's out there is online. So, when I began my research, it wasn't online. It was in person, in the courthouses, registers of deeds, cemeteries, archives. Now, most of what I began my research finding is online. Right. So people starting now are very fortunate. You can start online, but eventually you have to get to that county. You have to get to that location. The thing about connecting with the descendants of the slave owners is, they want to do their research also. And you can often work together. I'm in a group of one of such case where we have whites and blacks in the group, and we all descend either from the slave owner or one of the enslaved, and we're all working together to do the research. Right. So, don't carry shame, because none of us are responsible for what our ancestors did. But if you're sitting on something,
you're responsible
in your
for
home, that. Yes, you are responsible for that. And don't worry about how embarrassed you might be, because for someone else, that might be the only link to knowledge about one of their ancestors.
Right. Thank you so much for addressing that.
So I got a question here from Barbara. And
I want to do Barbara's at the end. We're going to come back to that one again.
We're going to do Barbara's at the end.
Yeah, I want to get through the couple of minutes, and then we'll do open Q&A, and hers kind of fits there. So hang tight, Barbara. We're going to get to your question. Let's go to the next myth. So the next myth is most African Americans also have Native American ancestry. Because we just talked about DNA, right? DNA, it doesn't help you. And now we're going to talk about ethnicities things.
Yes, this is one of the big ones that those of us that are involved in the research have had to fight for a long time. And many of us have had our eyes opened on our own lines. Okay. Also, I have another line where that was the case. And I had a relative who was descended maternally from the person who was supposedly 100% Native. I had a female relative to do the mtDNA, and she was descended from Africa, and that DNA does not lie. Right. And so you just have to nix that, no matter what your grandma, your great-grandma, your great-granddaddy told you. If the DNA doesn't support it, you have to look in another direction. And the truth of the matter is that the high cheekbones, the long black flowing hair, the tiny little bird lips like mine, top lip, all of that, the reddish toned skin, most of us got from our European genes. Okay. And I think, now don't quote me on this, even though I'm saying this on this show that's going to go down in history. I think that the number is something like 1 to 2% of African American people who identify as African Americans actually have Native blood. I think that's the number.
Mhm.
I also do know that between 20 and 25%, that all Africans have about 20. I'm not saying this correctly. About No. What is the right way to say it? Just a minute. Let me think.
Take your time.
I'm trying to say that the average African ancestor person has between 20 to 25% European ancestry.
Okay, I see.
That was actually one of the
Okay.
questions that just popped up is how common is it that African Americans have white ancestry?
I'm on some medication right now. Y'all give me a break.
Shh, don't tell anybody.
So that's what it is that, and so that is the case for the majority
So
of
the
African
average African American, and I guess we probably want to put a ring around this, and this would be for African Americans that have pre-1900 ancestors. Like if you immigrated from Africa 20 years ago and you married an African, then you're not necessarily going to have European ancestry. But
So let's say who descend from enslaved.
okay, so who descend there? That's probably better. Who
like that
descend
one.
from enslaved ancestors have, on average, 25% European ancestry. Okay.
20 to 25%, yes.
Right. Now, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with this, but a woman at my local genealogy society presented the fact that go back to the other slide, not all white people were the slave owners. That over in the Indian Territory on the Dawes Rolls, there are records of Native Americans who owned the slaves. And so did they have crossover? I mean, is that maybe where some of the myth is coming from? Or do you think it's just the cheekbone hairs that even us white crazy people keep saying, I have natives?
Yes, and it is just as common in the white population. You're exactly right. I'm not sure what you mean about crossed over, but yes, there were descendants of the 5 civilized tribes that had been owned by natives, and the expert on that is Angela Walton Raji. So if anybody wants to Google Angela Walton Raji, Raji at the end there, you will find plenty of information about that.
Okay.
So yes, there was intermingling.
That's the crossover I was talking about.
Yes, there was intermingling within those two groups. And so there are descendants that do actually have that native blood. And I think my understanding is that the freedmen from those groups are also, I think just recently, Nika Smith also talks about this, admitted into the tribe.
Oh, okay.
So I think that's correct. I don't really like talking about things that I'm not expert at, but I give you the names of the people to look up. Nika Smith and Angela Walton Raji.
Right. But see, and that's the beauty of genealogists. We know it isn't always that we know the answer. We know who has the answer.
Absolutely.
All right. So now we're ready for open Q&A. So if any of this conversation has sparked questions that you guys had, now is the time to drop it in there. We have a tendency to ask people to write the word question and then your question. So we know that it's a question rather than a comment between the two of you. And now we're getting to Barbara Scott's question. So go ahead.
So this has to do with 1890 census. And I think from enslaved people, this is important because you had the 1870 and the 1880 where they're first named, and then all of a sudden we have one where they're not. Whereas for the free people, they've got 4 or 5 censuses now in a row before they're missing this one. What comparable records for the 1890 period can be used since most of the records of the 1890 census are gone?
So a lot of the records that we've mentioned already, but also just be aware that a lot of states had state censuses during that time period, kind of in the early to mid 1890s, that can be helpful. Some states were already doing death records. You can look for death, marriage, birth records. my state didn't start till 1913, but it just depends on where you're looking. Look for church records, look for school records, maybe cemetery or burial records, but really look for a state census and also tax records. I'm sorry, tax records, yes, but what I really meant to say was voting records.
Okay.
Because I know the 1892 voting records have been helpful to me in my location.
Okay.
So just kind of anything, broaden it out, court records that we talked about earlier. I didn't mention the, I just said fast, I forgot the name of it. Let me come back to it. There was something on my mind.
That's all right. That's all right.
It was the one. It was the one for after the war where people were applying, but this 1890 is probably too far away for it. People were applying for reimbursement for their property that was damaged during the war, and right now it's just slipping my mind what the
Michael
name of
Strauss
it was.
is who you want to talk to about that, because he knows the name of those records off the top of his head.
And the
top
call
of his
number.
head.
And the call number.
Michael Strauss is wonderful for everything.
Yeah.
But yes, so those are just some examples, but really look for those state censuses because they're very helpful. I know Florida had them. That comes in off the top of my head. I'm not sure who else, but I know Florida had them.
Well, I want to also interject that I have a series with Lisa Leosin from Are You My Cousins? Here on our YouTube channel. We have a playlist of how to research around the 1890 census black hole. And I think now, from 1870 or 1865 forward, everybody's going to have an increased chance, regardless of your race, to appear in those records. So I highly recommend you go to our channel homepage and type in the search bar 1890 census and then Family History Fanatics, and then you're going to get a playlist of like 8 videos, I think, or it might have been 6. I think it was like 8. And just watch every single one, and it doesn't matter your ethnicity. As long as you're researching somebody in the U.S., then that's how you can research around that 1890 black hole.
So Mags asks, how do we get the Freedmen Bureau records and the Freedmen Bank records? Where are those located at?
Okay, so before I answer that question, let me just also mention census substitutes and things like the agricultural census records and things like that for the 1890 era. Look for those too.
Right.
Now, Freedmen's Bureau records, the quickest way to get to them is discoverfreedmen.org.
Yes, he's going to drop a link into that right now.
Okay.
Discoverfreedmen.org.
Freedmen.org.
Now, are these collections free? I remember doing some indexing through the Family Search about that.
Yes, they're through Family Search and it's free.
Perfect. Now, I remember working on some of them, and it would have a name, and I wouldn't be able to figure out, like, I looked at the record and how can anybody figure out this is their relative? So do you have any quick tips on researching in the Freedmen Bureau record?
Well, it's part of a larger research process. So, if you've already identified your formerly enslaved ancestor and you know where they were or who they were owned by, whatever, then you'll recognize them when you see them in these records. But if you're still in the process of doing that, then this might have to be something that you're using to build your theory or build your hypothesis that this is actually your ancestor.
All right, perfect. Andy's still working on typing in discoverfreedmen.org. It's coming out that doesn't want to work, so he'll keep working on that.
Okay, just discover and then Freedmen, MEN.
Oh, that's the problem. I put MAN.
So don't put MAN, put MEN.
Right. .org. And if all else fails, just go to Family Search and look for the Freedmen's Bureau collections.
Perfect. He found it. He's going to drop it.
I found it. I'm going to drop the correct link. Ignore the last link. I'm going to delete that one because that one was wrong.
Yeah, they helped you out there. They're like, Andy, you spelled it wrong.
Okay, so here's
I wish I could see the chat. I'll have to look at it after the fact.
Yeah. Well, he just deleted it, so you won't be able to see his misspelling.
we talked about earlier about African Americans and roughly, or on average, they have 25% European DNA. What about for white Americans? What percentage of them do you know have African DNA? Do you know that?
Or who would know that?
So I have a couple of notes, but I don't know if I have that.
We'll give you a moment to write it down.
I do not have that, but there is a number. So just have them Google it.
Okay.
Most of my information was coming from 23andMe, statistics from 23andMe. But if they just Google that question, they'll get an answer. I want to say it's. See, here I am guessing again, and I shouldn't do it.
I guess all the time. It's okay.
I think it's something like 4 to 6%.
That's
Just
actually what I would have said
what
too.
I've read.
And it's
Yes.
very variable depending on where your ancestors were from. So, for instance, if your ancestors are from the South, that's much more
Yes.
likely. If they were from New England, then that's much less likely. If they were, more recent immigrants, and I'm not talking after 1865, but if they were immigrating in 1830, that's less likely than if they had been there since the 1600s.
Mm-hmm.
So knowing where your ancestors are from, it's going to change that percentage.
Okay. So where's some other ones? We're looking through the chat now. We have kept you on for. I've just been so thrilled that you could come on and talk to us about these myths and how to get started. I knew that you came to the Texas State Genealogical Society conference and just knocked it out of the park with your presentation.
Mhm.
Now, I guess my next myth before we get to a question is, are all research projects hard when you're trying to research your ancestors? I know it seems odd, but I have a caveat after, but I want to hear your answer before I bias you.
You know what? I'm going to tell you, I have moved a little bit away from taking full research project clients recently to doing more coaching.
Uh-huh.
And I had a client for coaching about 2 weeks ago, and I did a 1-hour coaching session with her, but I had prepped for it.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out I was able to take her a generation back from her enslaved ancestor within that hour. And I want everybody to know, if it weren't, would not have happened. But she gave me access to her DNA information, and I was able to, you have to build out a tree and do all this work. But so that was relatively easy.
Right.
And I don't think anything is usually that easy.
Right.
So I'll say it's becoming easier, but it's really not usually easy. But those of us that are doing this, like, we like this kind of problem solving.
Right.
So it's fun.
Right.
So even though it might be hard, we think it's fun.
Okay.
The challenge of it is fun.
For sure.
We're kind of nerdy. I guess I'm a nerd.
Right. Well, I guess my thought was I had attended one of the presentations at TextGen, which wasn't yours. And TextGen is just my nickname because TXGS just doesn't roll off the tongue. Anyway, so at TextGen, I went to one presentation and I had just heard the myth. It is too hard, right? Too hard to do African American research. And this person did a presentation. I'm like, that was easy. Like, but as you say, they're not always easy, because think about any ancestor anywhere in the world. Sometimes you get lucky and it's easy, and sometimes it's challenging. So I think that myth needs to be killed, right, too. So do you have a question?
All right. Yeah. So I think this will be our last question. Then we got to wrap up.
Before the kids pound on the door.
And this is from True Geechee. How do you determine what state my enslaved ancestors originated? I know we've talked about a couple of things.
Yeah. I think the research just has to lead you to that. Although if you absolutely know nothing at all, you can use your DNA results to help you with that. I think I mentioned earlier, or maybe I just said it like as an aside, something about I'm in Virginia, my matches are in Georgia. But, I have these matches that keep coming up in Georgia, or they're either in Georgia or their ancestors were in Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a big hint to me as to where this particular ancestor's family may have originated from or been taken to, or, something. So, we don't always get answers. I've been doing this for 22 years, and I heard someone recently say they finished their genealogy research. That does not happen. Please, you can quote me on that. So it's an ongoing thing. And if you don't know anything, DNA, I just can't say it enough. DNA is really going to help point you in the right direction. You have to use a combination of paper research, documentary research, and DNA put together to help point you in the direction of where your ancestor, where their beginnings were here in America.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much for joining us today. Again, when we're done, we're going to drop in the link to Renata's blog and her Twitter handle, and you can follow up with any further questions you have there. If you're watching the replay, drop your comments in the comment section, and we will make sure she checks in periodically to respond to you. Before we go, we're going to go ahead and tell you about our next live stream. Our next live stream is going to be talking about the roadblocks to writing your family history. So we have this writing conference coming up, but I've had some really interesting emails that people have sent to me about why they're not writing their family histories.